She posted a tender, warm video of the family getting dressed up for prom. She wrote about her babies. She wrote about forever. She was telling everyone watching that her heart was completely full on the very same day that her husband would later choose as the official end of their life together. Either she had absolutely no idea what was already coming, or she was holding her entire world together with trembling hands while the ground was silently opening beneath her feet. Both possibilities are devastating in their own way. What is certain is that none of this was impulsive. Jelly Roll brought in one of the most respected divorce attorneys in all of Nashville, a lawyer known specifically for quietly steering famous people through their most painful endings. This was not a decision born from a single bad argument on a bad night. This was something measured, something planned, something he had been carrying in private long before any of us were given permission to see it. When the news finally broke, the only words offered by the people closest to them described it simply as a private family matter. That phrase is a door closing softly in your face. Everything that actually matters about this story lives on the other side of that door. In the first week of June, just days before the story exploded across every screen in the country, Jelly Roll performed at one of the largest country music festivals of the entire year. He stood on a massive stage before a crowd that genuinely adored him. And somebody finally noticed his hands. The wedding ring was gone. For a man who had permanently tattooed his devotion to this woman across his own body, an empty ring finger glowing under those enormous stage lights was not some small oversight. It was not forgetfulness. It was a confession he was making without ever speaking a single word into the microphone. And then there was Bunny, behaving exactly the way Bunny has always behaved whenever the world expects her to fall apart, which is by refusing to break anywhere that anyone can watch her do it. Just hours before the news detonated across every platform, she posted a photograph of herself looking strong and completely free. She wrote that she was finally getting her sparkle back. She lip-synced to an old rock song about being reminded of who you truly are underneath all the noise. The people who pay close attention to these kinds of moments understood the message instantly. She was not grieving publicly. She was rising, quietly, on her own terms, on her own timeline, exactly the way she has survived every single painful thing life has ever handed her. But to truly understand how and why this marriage ended, you have to go all the way back to where it began, because this was never supposed to be a love story at all. They met in the late summer of 2015 in Las Vegas. At that point in his life, Jelly Roll was a complete nobody. He was performing tiny shows for maybe 20 people at a time, sleeping inside an old white van that he had actually given a name to, surviving on $500 gigs without even an apartment key to call his own. Bunny was working as a high-end escort. She was in that same room that night, there with an entirely different man. By every rule that governs how the world is supposed to work, absolutely nothing about these two belonged together. He has laughed openly about the fact that she was not his type, and he was certainly not hers. That on paper the two of them made no sense whatsoever. But the way she tells the story of that first night, it will stop you cold every single time you hear it. She said that the very second she laid eyes on him, something deep inside of her went completely quiet, and simply said, "There you are," as though she had spent her entire life searching without knowing what she was searching for, and had finally found the one face that matched a feeling she had never been able to put into words. They didn't rush into romance. They built a genuine friendship first, a slow, real one. He would text her asking for advice about his young daughter. She would actually take the time to listen and to care. And by the summer of 2016, that quiet friendship had transformed into something that neither one of them could outrun any longer. On the very last night of August that year, standing together at a concert, he grabbed a microphone and asked her in the rawest, most unfiltered words imaginable whether she would marry him that very night in Las Vegas. She said yes without a single moment of hesitation. They drove straight to a small wedding chapel and got married on the spot. Two completely broke people gambling everything they had left on each other, with nothing in their pockets but a stubborn and beautiful kind of faith. And only days before that wedding, his life had already changed in another enormous way. He had welcomed a newborn son with a previous partner. Bunny did not flinch. She walked straight into all of the chaos and immediately helped him fight for custody of his young daughter, whose own mother was lost deep inside addiction. Think about what that actually meant. This woman married a struggling man and chose without hesitation to become a mother to children who were not hers by blood, on a budget that barely existed while building an entirely new life completely from the ground up. She even got herself sober for the sake of those children. That was the foundation these two built with their bare hands. And that foundation is exactly why what came next nearly destroyed every single piece of it. Only 2 years into the marriage, the entire fairy tale split right down the center. In 2018, Bunny discovered that her husband had been unfaithful to her. This was not one reckless night that he instantly regretted and confessed. By the accounts that have surfaced in the years since, this affair stretched across nearly an entire year. She has described the sheer gut punch of finally learning the truth, the horror of realizing that the one person she had trusted with all of her broken pieces had turned around and broken her all over again. She gathered up her life and went back to Las Vegas. The marriage, by every reasonable measure anyone could apply to it, was finished. Years later, Jelly Roll finally spoke about that dark chapter with a kind of raw, unflinching honesty that most famous men never find the courage to reach for. He called it one of the worst moments of his entire adult life. He admitted to the affair openly and without a single excuse. He spoke about the long, ugly, exhausting work it took just to begin attempting to repair what he had so carelessly shattered. He said that he was surrounded at that time by people who were cheating on their own wives, people who were lost inside addiction, and that he slowly became a mirror of whatever he chose to stand beside. He did not soften it with pretty language. He did not shift the blame onto her. He simply owned every piece of the wreckage he had caused. And Bunny, in her own time and in her own voice, eventually reframed the entire devastating chapter. She wrote that their castle built in sand had to crumble completely so that the two of them could finally rebuild on solid ground instead. But pay very close attention to the years hidden quietly inside that beautiful sentence. She has admitted that it took years, not months, but years for her to believe that this man truly loved her again. Years before she stopped feeling like something disposable that could simply be set aside. That single word, disposable, deserves to stay with you, because it reveals exactly how deep that wound was cut and how much trust had to be rebuilt one painful, exhausting brick at a time. This was not a couple who bounced back quickly and gracefully. This was two people who chose, against all logic and all odds, to rebuild something that most people would have simply walked away from and never looked back. Here is where the story gets complicated in a completely different way, because the harder these two worked to repair their marriage, the more the world around them began to transform in ways that neither of them could have ever prepared for. Bunny walked away from her old life entirely and built something that belonged completely to her. She launched a podcast, and it grew into a genuine empire. Looked back. Here is where the story gets complicated in a completely different way, because the harder these two worked to repair their marriage, the more the world around them began to transform in ways that neither of them could have ever prepared for. Bundy walked away from her old life entirely and built something that belonged completely to her. She launched a podcast, and it grew into a genuine empire. Well over 1 million downloads every single month, climbing all the way to the very top of the comedy charts. She was no longer the woman quietly waiting at home for a struggling artist to come back from the road. She had become a star in her own right, her own devoted audience, her own income, her own powerful voice that millions of people tuned in faithfully to hear every single week. Meanwhile, her husband became one of the most famous men in all of American music almost overnight. The struggling rapper who once slept inside that old white van suddenly had #1 songs, award show trophies, sold-out arenas, and a redemption story that the entire country fell in love with. He went from performing for 20 people in a tiny bar to filling enormous stadiums, and it happened in what truly felt like the blink of an eye. In the late summer of 2023, the two of them returned to that same Las Vegas chapel where it all began and renewed their vows. She called herself the luckiest girl alive that night, and for everyone watching, it looked like the final triumphant chapter of the most unlikely love story ever told. But fame is a strange and heavy thing to carry into a marriage that is still quietly healing from a deep and recent wound. He was constantly out on the road. She was building an entire world of her own that no longer depended on him at all. Two people who had once survived together inside the cramped space of a single white van were now living lives so enormous and so separate that the silence stretching between them only kept growing wider. And somewhere inside that growing distance, the simple question of who they truly were to each other slowly began to lose its old and easy answer. These two never once pretended to have a traditional marriage. Bunny has spoken openly and without shame about the fact that their relationship always operated by a completely different set of rules than most couples. She explained how a former working girl and a former street hustler simply do not love each other the same way two people raised behind white picket fences do. In her own writing, she described their bond as free rather than open, and she made it abundantly clear that their version of commitment looked nothing like the version most people picture the moment they hear the word marriage. To the two of them, that difference was never a weakness to hide. For many years, it was the entire secret behind their survival as a couple. Then, in the spring of 2025, Jelly Roll sat down for an interview and said something that almost nobody bothered to flag at the time. He warned that anybody who believes marriage is a one-size-fits-all kind of arrangement is eventually going to end up divorced. He said that any couple who thinks their relationship fits neatly into some standard mold is heading toward an ending within the next decade, for certain. On the surface, he was talking about other people. He was talking about the general public watching at home. But go back and listen to those words now, knowing everything we know, and they suddenly stop sounding like general advice. They start sounding like a man quietly describing the exact pressure that was slowly crushing his own home. That is the closest thing we have to an actual admission, and it is a genuinely haunting one. He never sat down and confessed a single dramatic reason for ending this marriage. Instead, over the years, he kept telling us, piece by piece, that a marriage only survives when both people keep choosing the same unusual shape together, again and again. The chilling implication is painfully simple. Somewhere along the way, one of them stopped fitting that shape, and the very freedom that once held them together so tightly slowly hardened into the distance that finally pulled them apart for good. If this story simply ended at two people drifting apart, it would be quietly sad but survivable. What makes this particular ending genuinely heartbreaking is what these two were still planning together right up until the very final months. For years they had carried a private ache that most of their fans never fully understood. They desperately wanted a child of their own together, and her body kept making that dream nearly impossible to reach. She has spoken with raw and painful honesty about blocked tubes, about losses she grieved quietly, about being forced into a medically induced version of menopause after a brutal reaction to fertility treatment. This was never some casual passing wish. This was a year-long battle fought almost entirely in private, with countless tears that rarely made it in front of a camera. And then, in the early part of 2026, they shared the most hopeful news of their entire journey together. They revealed that they had finally found a surrogate. They were preparing to welcome twins, using her eggs and his genes, at long last turning the dream they had first whispered about together into something real and within reach. Picture that timeline very carefully. They were openly and joyfully planning to bring two brand new lives into their family. They were standing together at award shows, thanking each other through visible tears, and then, within just a few short months, the very same man who had spoken so tenderly about those babies was quietly writing down a separation date and hiring a divorce attorney in Nashville. There are no easy words for what that timeline means. There is no clean explanation for what happened inside those final months, and perhaps that is the part of this story that truly haunts the most, not the ending itself, but the gap between the dream and the silence that followed. By every sign available to us, they are doing their best to end this the same careful, private way they survived everything else they ever faced together, quietly, and entirely on their own terms. The people surrounding them keep returning to the same gentle phrase, a mutual decision, a private family matter. He has already thrown himself straight back into a massive tour. She has very visibly begun reclaiming her own identity, posting about her sparkle returning, stepping back into the spotlight as a woman who flatly refuses to be defined by any man, even one she clearly loved this deeply for this long. The two of them still share the children they raised together, and that particular bond does not simply vanish because a marriage finally does. What keeps drawing people back to this story is the strange and quiet dignity in the way these two chose to let each other go. There were no leaked messages thrown into the world. There was no ugly, drawn-out public war waged across social media. Two people who first met as the single most unlikely pair imaginable, who somehow survived a van, a betrayal, a sudden tidal wave of fame, and a heartbreaking fight to build a family, simply looked at one another and quietly decided that loving each other no longer meant staying together. And honestly, after every single thing the two of them walked through side by side, maybe that gentle silence was the most loving gift they had left to offer each other. Some love stories don't end because the love disappears. Some love stories end because two people finally grow big enough to outgrow the shape they once shared. And when that happens, when two people who were everything to each other slowly become too large for the same room, the only thing left to do is let go. With grace, with silence, with the kind of respect that only comes from having truly known someone at their absolute worst and choosing to love them anyway. Jelly Roll and Bunny XO built something from absolutely nothing. And they are walking away from it the same way they built it, on their own terms, with their heads held high, and without asking a single person for permission. So before you click away, I genuinely have to ask you this. Do you believe this marriage was always quietly destined to break under the weight of all that fame and all that painful history? Or do you believe something very specific happened in those final silent months? Something that the rest of us may never truly be allowed to know? Drop your most honest thoughts in the comments, because this story is not finished yet, and something tells me we have not heard the last word from either of them.